Hello and welcome, everyone, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening where you are. We are thrilled to have you join us today for Onsite Gallery's virtual curator artist talk with guest curator of the Delaney Family Emerging Curators Prize exhibition, Avalon Mott, as well as the artists Nabil Azab and Shannon Garden-Smith. My name is Susan Jama, and I'm the Programs and Community Coordinator at Onsite Gallery located at 199 Richmond Street West. I would like to begin with the land acknowledgement. Onsite Gallery and OCAD University acknowledges the ancestral territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, and the Wendat, who are the original owners and custodians of the land on which we work, stand, and create in. Onsite Gallery at OCAD University is situated in Tech Toronto, Turtle Island, Toronto, Canada. We also acknowledge all treaty peoples, including those who came here as settlers, as migrants, either in this generation or in generations past, and those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly those brought to these lands as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. We pay tribute to those ancestors of African origin and descent. I also would like to acknowledge our supporters. Onsite Gallery acknowledges the support from the Canada Council for the Arts, Ontario Arts Council, the Government of Ontario, the Toronto Arts Council, and Nexus. On behalf of Onsite Gallery, we would like to thank the Delaney family for their generous gift, which is supporting Onsite Gallery's latest initiative, the Delaney Family Emerging Curators Prize. This annual prize was established to support the professional curatorial practice among recent graduates of the university's MFA in Criticism and Curatorial Practice program. This year, Onsite Gallery launched the inaugural Emerging Curators Prize exhibition titled Presence in the Past or Undetermined Future with guest curator and recipient Avalon Mott. So without further ado, I would like to begin a little bit about the exhibition as well as the artists, and Avalon will also introduce themselves. So today's curator and artist talk unfolds in conversation with the curator Avalon and the artists of the exhibition Shannon and Nabil, Presence in a Past or Undetermined Future. The exhibition is currently on view at Onsite Gallery up until Saturday, May 17 in Toronto. This exhibition is a two-person exhibition that brings together the immersive practices of artists Nabil and Shannon, whose works invite a deeper encounter with time, calling forth echoes of the past while gently ushering us towards what is yet to come. Rooted in presence, Avalon has curated an exhibition for reflection and emotional resonance. Through carefully constructed visual and spatial experiences, the artists encourage viewers to linger, to engage in a practice of sustained attentive looking. In doing so, we are invited into a state of affect where feeling, memory, and imagination intermingle. It is within this liminal space where past and future eclipse that the present moment becomes more vividly felt. And today's conversation, it seeks to open up the layers of thought, process, and intention behind the exhibition, offering insight into how the works were conceived and how they continue to unfold in dialogue with the viewers, space, and time. And for those of us who are joining us online, if you have any questions you would like to ask us, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and we will get to the Q&A session with the audience towards the end of the talk. So without further ado, I would like to welcome into the virtual space Avalon, Shannon, and Nabil. To get things started, I would like to start with Avalon. Avalon, as the curator of the exhibition, would you be able to introduce yourself, share a bit about your background, as well as your approach to your curatorial practice?
Of course. Thank you, Susan, for that. And huge thank you to Shannon and Nabil for joining me today. How interesting is this, right? We're in this virtual space together. We're talking about an exhibition that is physically somewhere else right now. And I feel like if I was in front of you all who are joining us today, I would have a notepad and I would kind of have it on my lap. And so I just want to acknowledge that I do have some notes here. And so if I'm looking down at them, it's just as if we were together in a room. Um, so a little bit about me. I am originally from Vancouver. I came to Toronto in 2021 to begin my studies at OCAD in the Master of Criticism and Curatorial Practice program. Prior to that, I graduated from Emily Carr University with my BFA in photography and minor in social practice and community engagement. And this is something for me and within my curatorial practice that I think about a lot is kind of this intersection of my curatorial practice and my photographic background. For me, both of these spaces are a way of framing something that I want to capture, I want to kind of lead the viewer towards. And so there is a lot of conversation between these two practices for me. After graduating, or actually while I was still a student at OCAD, I assumed the director position at X Space Cultural Center, and I've been there since 2022. And last year, I joined the Plum, which is an artist collective here in Toronto, and I'm a contributing curatorial member there as well. A little bit about the exhibition now, maybe, and I have some slides. I'm sure that some of you have already seen the exhibition in person, but for those of you who haven't, just to kind of give an expanded layout of the exhibition. I know that both Shannon and Nabil are going to talk about their pieces a little bit more specifically. And so this image for me really encapsulates how I was thinking about bringing Shannon and Nabil together. Both of their practices have this affective quality, which for me as a curator is a really, really important thing and definitely a through line throughout my exhibitions. And when I think about affect, I'm thinking specifically about this emerging curatorial methodology called exhibitionary affect. And how I've come to understand this and kind of bring it forward into my exhibitions is really allowing the space or a place for the viewer to be able to gain relational experiences to the work on display rather than being told how to understand the exhibition as a whole. And so really foregrounding feeling states rather than directing the viewer around the exhibition itself. And so there's things that I think about in terms of being able to kind of poke at this or heighten this. And it's things such as site-specific work is something that I really enjoy working with. And so we can see from both Shannon and Nabil that there are, really glorious displays here of site-specific work within the exhibition. And I think for me, this relationship towards exhibitionary affect and really kind of drilling into what this means is also a way to highlight the difference between education and learning. For me, it is a success or something that I strive for to have folks be able to learn something through the exhibition. And that doesn't necessarily mean coming out with an understanding, but more so with a curiosity, something that they leave an impression that drives them to kind of reflect and think on something further. And so again, with both Nabil and Shannon's work, something that I really drew me towards them was this idea of prolonged looking and how they're holding that both within kind of translucencies and abstraction within their work. There's that playground that they both create to be able to engage the viewer in something that holds their attention and also kind of allows them to linger. And so this idea of holding intention is really key to this exhibition, holding space with intention. And within that, these works being able to guide the viewer towards a space of affect. And I think when I was thinking about conceiving this exhibition and thinking about what I wanted to submit, I was really thinking about a place where right now we could stop. There is so much that is happening in our world around us that is being relayed back to us in real time, and sometimes even faster than real time, that it's a lot for us to be able to ingest and kind of sit with and understand how we feel about things. And so, this idea of looking backward and forward simultaneously, there's a lot of spaces that are asking us to do that right now. And the premise is that only when we actually take that moment to pause and am able to understand this information that we're being given, understand how it relates to our histories and our feelings and our communities, are we then able to move forward into our future in a meaningful way. And so within this exhibition, that's really what I was hoping to be able to accomplish, is to be able to give viewers a space to pause and have that opportunity to think backwards to a history, forwards to a future from a place of presence. Thank you.
Thank you, Avalon. I guess my next question to you, Avalon, is what was the initial inspiration in putting this exhibition together, like the intention behind it? I know you've mentioned a little bit, but if you don't
Mhm.
mind expanding on it, that would be awesome because it's really great to see the exhibition and being in the space in the exhibition inside the gallery. Um, but I would love to hear
Yeah.
sparked that
Yeah.
inspiration.
I think something, again, kind of like oscillating between that photographer curator intersection, something that I've always had a really heightened relationship to is light and its
Mhm,
ability to kind of hold a place and also change a space so dramatically. And that can be really just tracking the light through the room for an hour of time, or it can be the difference between, fluorescent light and soft lighting in a
mhm,
space. And so I think that was also something that I was thinking a lot about in this exhibition, was bringing together works that would kind of heighten the importance of light. And especially because On-Site has this beautiful window that we're working with. And there was the duration also around this exhibition being up for almost 4 months. And so quite literally the quality of light during that time would change as well. And thinking about the duration of time like that was also something that I was thinking about.
mhm. That's so beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing.
Of course.
So now I'm going to turn the table to Shannon and Nabil. We would love to hear from you as well. If you don't mind introducing yourselves, telling us a little bit about your background and your own artistic practice. I'm not sure who would like to go first. Go ahead, Nabil.
You want me to go?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really yeah, this exhibition's really special and I feel pretty honored to be able to hold space with everybody. And I really think there's been so much good communication with all three of us. And I think these sort of tight exhibitions with two people are always, to me, super, super interesting. I think duo shows create a sort of poetry that's really, really interesting and highlights is an opportunity to also, like in this instance, kind of looking into our artistic practices a little bit further. But I'm Nabil Azab. I'm a visual artist. I'm mostly lens-based, but I do a lot of research and painting and drawing and writing as well. But most of my works revolve around the photographic apparatus, and I'm really interested in the early history of photography and kind of those sort of implications on image saturation and culture today. I was born in France, in Paris to Egyptian immigrants, and made my way to the west coast of Canada to Vancouver when I was quite young as well, and kind of spent time in both areas. And in Vancouver, I was really exposed to this kind of conceptual school of photography that was all around me as well. So that had a big impact on my sort of learning about photography and understanding it better in some ways. I'm currently in Los Angeles. I'm studying at the University of California, Riverside. I'm getting my MFA and I'm teaching here. Um, and this exhibition was so um, Great. I mean, these were especially in regards to the sort of I use a lot of found photographs and archival images in my work, and this, especially the large vinyl work, January 1, 2021, was a work that had been sitting in my studio for a long time, and I had really contemplated making a work based on this found image for a long time. So it really felt just the perfect moment between Avalon and Shannon and I to sort of execute it and make it happen. And yeah, I'm really psyched about the way it turned out. So that's a bit about me for now.
Thank you, Nabil.
I love that. Feeling the love, feeling the affect. Um, yeah, I'm going to echo a lot of what Nabil said. But first of all, yes, thank you, Susan, for hosting today so wonderfully. Thank you, Avalon, for bringing us together. Thank you, Nabil. I've been so interested in your practice, really for as long as I've known about your work. So also very delighted to share this space. And I agree with you. I think there's something very particular and special about the two-person show configuration. It's quite intimate. It's quite a scary thing, actually, sometimes to kind of work in that configuration. So I do think there was a lot of, at least on my part, a lot of respect and a lot of trust that Avalon built. So that relationality is kind of in practice in this show as well. Okay, who am I? It's the hardest question. So my name is Shannon Garden-Smith. She, her, hers pronouns. I am joining you here from Takaranto, from Toronto, specifically calling from the University of Toronto. We may talk about institutions at some point later in the talk. I'm based here, and I have been for quite a lot of time. I have Scottish and Irish settler heritage, something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and also sort of being in connection with, certainly during my younger years, and continue to kind of think about what it is to be a settler on these lands. Really broadly, my practice is really kind of engaging with, I think, a lot of land-based methods. So that's a thread that I hope we'll have a chance to talk more about today. I grew up not so far away. I grew up in Stratford, Ontario. Many of you may know it. The festival is there. And as I mentioned, I've lived in Toronto for a long time. I came here to begin an undergrad at the University of Toronto. I didn't think that I had it in me to pursue a life as an artist, so I came not to be an artist. And I think sometimes you can't escape your fate. If you can, then you should. So I did my undergrad at University of Toronto, learned a lot about what the kind of power of art can be in that time in my life. I later completed an MFA at the University of Guelph. That was in 2017. And I am perhaps a sucker for punishment, and I'm back doing doctoral studies currently at York University, but it's not punishing. It's actually been really, really wonderful. So again, perhaps we can talk about that more later. I found that, oftentimes for the sake of efficiency, I say that I work in sculpture and installation. That is not untrue. It is true. I do work in sculpture and installation, but I learned to start saying that, I think, during my MFA. Just sometimes you need a shorthand. And with a little bit more space here, maybe I can share that I really wasn't trained directly in sculpture and installation. And that's actually something that I hold with a lot of pride in some ways. I think it was through a kind of, uneducation that I moved towards working in this way. And I would just really say that across my practice, it's really kind of driven by a materially experimental practice. So a deep attunement to materials, to their affordances, to the kind of amazing, deep, broad histories that tell us kind of so much about where we are today that materials can tell us. And I learned a lot of that through, through people who have come before me. So through lots of amazing artists who worked in kind of unconventional ways in sculpture and installation. And hopefully I'll talk about them more later. I think that's enough.
Okay, thank you so much, Shannon. Yeah, honestly, the exhibition, it is gorgeous. So if y'all haven't had the chance to visit, please do so. We're located at 199 Richmond Street West. Shannon and Nabil's work, they work really closely well together in the space. And like Avalon has said, the lighting in the space really brings out their works together. So come by and check us out. But I think I will hand the floor to Nabil, as Nabil will present a little bit more about the work and give us a beautiful presentation. So the floor is yours, Nabil.
Thank you so much. I'm just putting my computer on Do Not Disturb so you don't get my email notifications.
It's okay. I did the same with my phone.
Yeah. Can everybody see this? That's great. I'll try to be I'm going to flow through a lot of different parts of my practice and some earlier works, but kind of talk about some of the common threads that led me to the works that made their way to the show in at Onsite. And first I want to talk about some of my research that I've been doing here at the University of California, and I've been thinking a lot about this aspect of blur that seems to happen in my work often, and thinking about blur in photography, and really thinking more about how blur is really kind of a photographic phenomenon that has kind of arisen from the camera, and sort of the complexity of trying to think about how a moment in time can be created through the camera, and this sort of subjective reality that it does indeed have, in comparison to its sort of quality of truth that many people are sort of its representational qualities that are what has made it so useful to us as a society in some ways. And this is just an image that I spoke about often, and I think it's also important to note that I use a lot of found images and archives in my work, and a lot of time some of that doesn't really enter into the work, but becomes sort of research and images that linger in my mind in some ways. And this is one of those images that I came across in the Met collection, taken by Ernest Beneki on the Nile in Egypt in 1852. So this is a really early historical piece of photography. This is really sort of the entrance of it, and also this sort of dangerous time of Orientalism and the European camera coming, and the sort of colonial gaze in Egypt and all around North Africa. But it's kind of this stunning, really odd, bizarre image, and has these aspects of blur that are seemingly unintentional. And I think that's a good kind of starting point for thinking about the work that's in the exhibition, and thinking about how blur is activated, and the sort of emotive qualities that it does have in sort of registering time in that way. Another image, if we're going to talk about blur, is Richter's sort of pyramids and photographic studies, which this is actually a photograph that was taken by him on his studies of Egypt. And it's interesting to note sort of like, the icon of the pyramids that's out of focus, but what is in focus is actually sort of this dust that is on the front of the camera, and these sort of little moments, which is obviously sort of the dust of Giza, of Cairo, which is covers you when you're there in some ways. And this sort of becomes the subject of the photograph in some ways, because the camera obviously needs to focus on something. Even if something is out of focus, its plane of focus is somewhere. And in this case, it's kind of on the lens of the camera. And so we see this dust. And so I'm just kind of like weaving this sort of metaphorical through line to start thinking about how I'm thinking about photographs and how I think they are historically placed and how they've affected my own identity and sort of the sort of projects that I try to make. This was one of my first solo exhibitions, which was in 2019 at Calaboose, which was this little sort of garage, sort of old horse stable in Montreal. There was this really beautiful space that I was invited to work in. And it's also, I think it's important that the idea of site specificity came up. And I think that's such an important part of working as an artist that, you know, it felt like even for me, even the January 1st work was so, you know, even though it might not have total sort of historical relation to the space in some way, it felt so architecturally sort of involved with the space in some way, that we're working with a certain wall, that we're kind of imagining what should be in this space to sort of activate it. And I love this idea of thinking about the sort of pause. And yeah, it's interesting to think about in this moment in time as well. But back to this work, yeah, especially it's sort of this work, Discord, which was a pretty large work, kind of is this beginning of this sort of working with found images. This was an image that I found in Vancouver that was the cover of a university sort of music magazine called Discord from the mid 80s, and I was able to track down this image and use it. And yeah, there's a lot of abstraction, there's a lot of cropping and kind of manipulating the image in some way and presenting it to a viewer in this sort of vacuum. And it talks about the history of the image, but it also speaks to, exactly as Avalon's saying, this sort of futurity of an image and how we can manipulate these images to sort of have a different ancestry to them and bring a new life to these sort of images. Writing is a big part of my practice as well. Even if it doesn't show up in pieces, I'm often writing through my thoughts and writing about the photographs that I encounter and thinking about different ways that I can use them and activate them in my sort of photographic projects. This was another exhibition in Vancouver. I sort of began this process of projecting images on the studio of my wall and making these sort of light paintings out of them with a lot of family archives, a lot of archives from Egypt from the sort of 1940s and 50s. Yeah, and making these sort of gestural light paintings is the easiest word to put it, but these sort of long exposures of the projection of this archival material and kind of talking about the sort of emotional aspects of photography rather than their sort of historical specificity in some sort of way. And this is that same process, but again, working in color and working with color archives, essentially. This is a really important image, as it's kind of the basis for a lot of for some of the untitled works that are in the show at Onsite. Yeah, and I often work with sort of one image and we'll make multiple works from that image in some sort of way. And manipulated this image that I found, and this was sort of the toppling of a statue in the Suez Canal, which my family helped build. And this was kind of a turning point in Egyptian history in some ways. And I thought it was important I thought this image just really encapsulated that moment and this sort of turn in history in some ways. And thinking about how photography has that power in a lot of ways to sort of, yeah, envelop history in itself and sort of be this mirror for what we see, and also kind of train us to understand history in a very different way. And so I chose to work with this image and kind of scrawl on it and scribble and draw on it as well to put my own sort of understanding of it and my understanding of the history that it signifies. And this was another image that I made from those sort of source images that was in another show in Toronto. Again, blur is sort of this really important aspect of the work in some way, that there's this sort of transparency to the work, that there's um, they're hard to understand in some ways, but they create a whole new vision of this sort of historical material, and it completely obfuscates this sort of material in some way for a completely different understanding of history. And it's so interesting to kind of um, see people's reactions to where the work comes from and the sort of archival sources of this work, and the sort of ambiguity that it holds in some ways, I think can be a really like powerful tool for understanding history and preserving a positive future as well. And again, it's really about these sort of found images that keep reoccurring in my work. And it's also just comes from a really profound love of images as we all have, I think, to a certain degree, even if they're just images of our everyday on the street. Yeah, and the image from the January 1st work as well, that is the vinyl piece on the wall, is also a really comes from an actual found image that is sort of I happened upon on the street and just found the back of the image. And I was so drawn to sort of these scratches, and working in photography for a long time. I also knew that this was that this was an old print. It wasn't something that was made recently. And when I flipped it over, I found this pretty haunting picture of a man that could be a relative of mine in some sort of way. And this image just stayed in my studio for quite some time. And um, I'd often just kind of come back to it, and I never knew sort of how to um, activate it in some way, or even if it should just be this material that speaks to me and that I'll just keep for myself in some way. But when Avalon approached me with this sort of idea of the project and the sort of ideas that drew Avalon to my work, it felt like such a perfect sort of mix for what we were trying to accomplish, and talking about sort of um, yeah, I mean, the shared interest in photography and the shared interest in time and the shared interest in sort of um, our effect on history in some ways, and that moving forward. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at there for now.
Okay, thank you so much, Nabil, for the fantastic presentation.
Of
Um,
course, I'll stop sharing my screen.
but no, actually, oh, never mind. It's fine.
Oh,
It's
sorry.
okay. But I was wondering, the untitled images that you just showed us, part
Yeah.
of the image where it had like the one that you said, the Swiss Canal, is that the image that you blew up, or?
Yeah, so it's basically a blown up image. I sort of have a collage process in the
Uh-huh.
studio in a lot of ways. So I'm reprinting this image and manipulating it physically as well, and drawing on top of it. And then the untitled work is actually just a collage of multiple pieces of that image, kind of collaged together.
Cool. Awesome. So I'm going to pass the floor to Shannon, and Shannon will present just as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll start sharing in a moment. Just to say, it's so nice to finally do this talk and just spend a little bit more time talking about our practices, because it's drawing out so many connections, materially or methodologically. So thinking about blur and dust and light, and thinking about working with materials that come from the archive, and finding a way to work with them so that they maybe reveal something. Maybe it was there all along. Maybe it's actually about refocusing on the subject as dust. But yeah, seeing something else, seeing another narrative that opens up different possibilities. I feel, yeah, very excited to learn more about that from Nabil. And I think these are things you will see as I share now that I'm also really interested in, and maybe approaching from a different way, but there are so many connections. So let me get my slides up. Voila, can we see? Brilliant. Okay. So yeah, like Nabil, I wanted to take this opportunity to maybe give you a little bit of a taste of a number of different projects, and then through this kind of little talk to bring us to the work that's in the current exhibition at Onsite, and to kind of tease out some of those connections materially, methodologically, and so forth. So I start here at this work that is called Snail Work, or Give the Colors What Turns You Please, from 2023. Now, the work that you see in front of you is also kind of not really the work, in my view. So I'm going to show you some snapshots of what I see as really what this work is. Yeah, but with this teaser, I like to begin with this work because I think a lot of people have had an opportunity perhaps to see this work, to interact with it. It's a work, yeah, people maybe often know me for. So I think it's a good place to begin. I do want to give a shout out to Patel Brown Gallery here in Toronto that hosted this work, this first work in 2023. So this is an installation of unfixed pigmented sand. It's the scale of the room in this case. And to make this work, I've worked actually with I work with materials also from the archives. So I've been working with these marbling prints. This is the actual print that I've worked with in this work, that come from various rare book libraries, various archives. This one comes from the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library here at the University of Toronto. And I've been working with these incredible patterns for a number of years now. And I often like to begin by saying that my process is, when it's kind of at its best, maybe led by a little bit of a sense of intuition. So I can't remember when I first really started thinking about marbling prints, but they're just something that have caught me. There's something amazing and sticky about them. I can't stop looking at them, no matter how much time, and it's an inordinate amount of time that I've spent with them. I just find them kind of continually mesmerizing, in a lot of different ways. And of course, that's in part because these patterns are mesmerizing. You know, there's something about them. There's this kind of repetition. There's this kind of incredible movement to these patterns. And so they, they're visually very sumptuous, and they kind of wrap you up in this movement. I want to talk more about these prints, but I also want to bring us back to the work as well. So I'll toggle back and forth. So these prints, I sort of kept working with them, not really knowing why at first. And over time, I began to realize that actually, first of all, I'm finding these prints in the end pages of books. Now, I'm really specifically working with marbling prints that are usually coming from the 19th century, maybe kind of 18th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, usually coming from a context where they are existing as end papers in books that are often coming from Victorian England or from other kind of European nation states. There's quite a lot of history to get into with that. So really briefly, because I could spend the whole 2 hours telling you about this, but really, really briefly, I think it's important to know that these marbling prints are sort of made through this process where essentially you thicken a bath of water, you make it almost jelly-like, but not quite, so that it can hold pigment on the surface. So you flick pigment on the surface, and then you move through that water with a stylus or a comb, and you manipulate the pigments, and you manipulate them into these various patterns. Now, marbling may be extremely obvious to everyone who's listening, but it's called that in part because some of the patterns, especially when not so manipulated, when they're more organic, they look a lot like the veining in stone. So they're this kind of simulacrum almost of the kind of look of stone. And they're very, of course, involved in surface, in pattern, in ornament. So that's sort of briefly how the patterns are made. When I made this connection that they're called marbled end papers because of this connection to emulating stone, it really kind of deepened and opened up other avenues for working with these patterns. Because I had in fact been working a lot with and researching the material of sand. Sand being this material that is actually everywhere in our built world these days. Really, all of our kind of contemporary buildings are made out of sand, whether in the form of concrete or in the form of glass. So I had been thinking a lot and working a lot with sand. And, finally, this connection to stone was revealed to me through these kind of beautiful, sumptuous patterns that feel perhaps very distant from when we think of sand immediately. But for me, there are so many kinds of connections actually across how these materials function, how these prints come to be. So I've been working with sand for a number of years. And so I create these installations with unfixed sand. I pigment the sand by hand to sort of get, as close as I can to that real kind of vibrancy of color that is in the original historical prints. And then I create these architecturally scaled installations working with the prints. They're sort of mirrored across the space and sized in order to fit the space kind of seamlessly. And then I invite people into the work. And I invite folks in to the work. And for me, this is actually the work. So of course I find, partially I think the power of the work is that people, initially when they're coming across the installation, are fairly taken with the amount of kind of labor, the amount of detail, the amount of time that goes into the process for sure. And then, oftentimes people have really different reactions to the invitation to kind of walk or move through the work. Many people see this as a kind of unmaking of the work. And I would maybe agree with that. But for me, that unmaking is really actually the work itself. I've touched on it really briefly, but the kind of provenance of these prints, this kind of space that they come from, coming from within, the end pages. So this kind of incredible interior space of these historical books. This is not a neutral thing. So I've been coming to really kind of think about that kind of cultural object, the work of especially the English language book, and maybe especially the English language novel of the 19th century, as really kind of invested also in naturalizing certain kinds of colonial logics at the time in a way that kind of continues into the present. And they do this in a kind of cultural form. And so it's maybe, it doesn't kind of hit us over the head, but it's something that then becomes kind of assumed and naturalized and sort of written into how stories are told. And there's a lot of these books really deal with, or maybe set in places where they're kind of talking about again, naturalizing these kinds of relationships to private property, to the kind of estate, to the manor home. So there are all these kind of connections that are at play in some of those, 19th century novels in particular. I find that the end papers are, I don't know, they are there. They are there alongside these marbling papers really proliferated during this time, especially in England, alongside the proliferation of these books. But I find that they're maybe doing something a little bit different, or they're strange, and there's a way in which they've been oddly overlooked because they are so visual. It's how can you not kind of spend time looking or being mesmerized or kind of sucked into a different time with the prints, but they're not the content of the book. And oftentimes, I work with lots of amazing archivists and librarians who help me out a ton. But it's really funny because oftentimes the marbled papers are not even noted in archival systems. So sometimes it's a bit of a wild goose chase, or you have to get lucky that an archivist has taken a kind of special interest in this kind of part of the book. So I find this all very interesting, and it's also this presence again of lithic material, of stone, of sand, of marble, which these books are actually, all kind of circulating around these questions of land and circulating around, reorienting relationships to land. And so I find that these prints are referencing that in some kind of way that is maybe a little bit different than the intentions of the book. So I invite people in to this work. And it's interesting because I've been thinking about the blur, and I hope we'll talk about it more in a little while. But really what happens is when I invite people into this work, I kind of think about it as they're actually activating the work. So they're activating it in the way that I kind of think the marbling process, that is kind of true to the marbling process in the first instance. I sort of think about this marbling process as, being something that's really kind of quite lively. I sort of think of it almost as a kind of dance, these pigments that cross water. There's this kind of creation of certain kinds of patterns. It feels like, feels like a kind of choreography that is performed again and again. And I should say that the prints are monoprints. So the marbler would be flicking pigments on the water bath and creating one print each time, but there are certain kinds of patterns that reappear over and over again. So I see that as a kind of, dance that's reperformed again and again. And yeah, so inviting people in, I see it as they're actually kind of enlivening the patterns again, so that they're kind of open and vital, and kind of making us think again, maybe about stone, which is, so kind of more conventionally associated with something that is kind of quite firm, quite immobile in a lot of ways. So just reintroducing this idea of a kind of vitality into our understanding of stone. And yeah, in a way, people are undoing the work, or they're erasing these prints. That might be one way of thinking about it. But I also really kind of think about it as a way in which a new pattern is being formed. So these different patterns that are collectively made come out of the work. So we start to see the prints of people's movement. And it's not a kind of stable thing. It's really changing throughout the course of any given exhibition. And so for me, that's kind of the pattern that I'm aiming for, is this thing that I can't actually really control the outcome of, and to have this kind of beautiful, this kind of space that I think really does change people's relationship to the ways that they maybe ordinarily move through the world. Suddenly people are paying a lot of attention to how they're moving. They're maybe spending more time also looking at the traces of how other people move. I love the idea of having people, really actually thinking more deeply, or feeling more deeply this kind of connection, this touch with sand, because it's actually something that we're doing all the time. Yeah, anytime we're moving across a sidewalk or the tarmac, or even using our devices, moving our hands across the glass of our phones, we're kind of in contact with this material all the time. But it's very invisibilized in a lot of ways. So how am I doing for time? I meant to set a timer and I didn't. You just tell me,
Okay.
Susan, if I need to hurry
No,
up.
no, just keep going. It's super interesting to listen to the work and the interaction that the participants do have with your work.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Okay. So just to show you another instance of a kind of similar approach, I had the pleasure of working with Danica Pintrick, really amazing curator for this past Nuit Blanche in Toronto, and created this really, I don't know if the photograph even really gives you a sense, but it's a really kind of enormous space that I got to work in, that has this relationship right with Lake Ontario, is kind of right outside of those windows. So another snail work dedicated to the lake in this instance. And again, I worked with prints from, in this case, also from the Thomas Fisher Rare Books Library. So this is after thousands of people had the opportunity to move through the work, and I do just want to show a little bit of that process. I, really specifically say move through the work. This was a really exciting invitation because the space was actually accessible. So oftentimes I've found maybe working in different spaces. In the first instance, the work, people need to move up a flight of stairs to actually access the space. So there's actually a way in which, if this work is kind of about indexing movement, or, undoing a pattern and seeing a new kind of pattern of movement emerge, to me, it's really important that that kind of movement doesn't just mean a kind of able-bodied movement. So it was really exciting this for Nuit Blanche, this space was accessible, and we got to invite folks in who use mobility devices. Yeah, so that was really important, and for me, that's key actually to a kind of collective image making of movement. Yeah, and you can see that the work it's really interesting how folks react sometimes to how the work has unfolded after interaction. For me, this is so much more exciting than kind of the original work in a lot of ways. A lot of people, the blur is kind of difficult to deal with. They really want to hold on to that kind of perfection of the original installation. But again, I included this image to kind of also show the way in which you kind of shift from seeing this all over pattern to, maybe paying attention to these moments of detail, these kind of chance comings together, this kind of massive, almost collaging together of movement. I'm glad I included it too, actually. I wanted to talk a little bit about an aspect of my practice, which often, I'm thinking a lot about materials, thinking a lot about land, and I'm thinking often about the kind of ethics of working with material. And oftentimes I will gather materials to work with. So this was a project that was shown in the Goldfarb Gallery, formerly the Art Gallery of York University vitrines. And these are prints that are made that, again, work with recreating these marbling prints, but I've used a kind of colored dust to create these works. And I gather that I come to have this dust by actually kind of gathering this wayward sand from around the city. So sand that's kind of at the curb, or maybe at the edge of a sidewalk or something like that. I actually move about the city with a little dustpan and vessels to collect and work with this material. So that's what I've done for these vitrines. And the process, much like the sand floors, the pattern kind of stays quite open, open to change, open to flux. So you'll see in this case, these kind of prints of noting where I've touched the material. And I wanted to bring us quickly also into the material of gelatin that is is the material that I've worked with for the work at On-Site Gallery. And just to note this exhibition from 2021 with Franz Kaka, where I was first working with this material and working with it for lots of the kind of same reasons, that has this kind of openness to it. When we think of something gelatinous, it's in between states. There's this kind of shiftiness to it, much like sand, where something can kind of be in flux, in movement. And really quickly, I wanted to take this opportunity to share a little bit about the title of the work, which I actually took from an interview with Leonora Carrington, this really incredible painter, mostly from the 20th century. She talks about this idea of the form, which is also a word for a hare as in a rabbit's nest, a hare's nest. So in a hare's form is sort of like in a hare's nest in a way. And Leonora Carrington has this quote in an interview where she says, our space is like a form, like a container. I think our lives and the places we live in are like a dish that contains a jelly, and that substance sort of melts and disintegrates. I think we're sort of like that in a way. Paintings are like that. So I really love this idea that she kind of took up this this word, the form, the rabbit's nest, but also kind of thinking about it and connecting it to the space of everyday living, connecting it to kind of thinking about these principles of melting and disintegrating, and then connecting that for her to a practice of painting and making. And I will also note with this work that I've again kind of used this process of gathering these pieces of these clippings from plants that I gather from kind of all across the city that are embedded in the gelatin. And maybe in our discussions, we'll talk more about the aspect of light in the work. I later, began to make these kind of eccentric blind sculptures and had the opportunity to do also a two-person show, really amazing opportunity with Amanda Boulos. So this work came out of that kind of two-person development of a show where we were really thinking a lot about questions of visibility, often maybe the violence actually that's involved in a kind of clarity of image sometimes. Perhaps we'll talk about that more. I think there's a lot of connections with Nabil's practice and kind of thinking through the history of photography. But here I'm working with the blind form. I mean, it's this kind of mechanism that actually, in a way, it's meant to kind of block vision in a way. It's not really supposed to be the thing that you look at. Again, like the end papers in the books, it's kind of not, normally we're not looking at the blind. And there's also something strange and porous about these. There's a transparency to them. You also look through them. So there's this kind of, further strangeness of, yeah, looking at a blind that you're not really supposed to be looking at, but also in looking at it, you're looking through it. So it's really kind of beckoning to its kind of larger environment. And I don't really think I have so much time to talk about these artists, but I did want to give a shout out to, just two artists who were really core, maybe to that body of work in particular. Swiss artist Heidi Bucher, who made these incredible installations where she worked with and was kind of revisiting domestic spaces, and she makes these really haunting and really kind of abject, amazing, what she calls skinnings of these rooms that held a lot of importance for her. And in this way, she's kind of revisiting the room and saying there's actually something that we need to kind of deal with further in this space. This kind of blank wall actually becomes the thing that needs to be contended with. Eva Hesse, also incredibly important artist for my practice. So I wanted to end then with the work that's here at On-Site Gallery. And Avalon spoke about her interest in working often with site-specific work. So just to gesture to the fact that this work came out of an earlier project where I was working in this kind of colonnade space at University College here at U of T, invited by amazing curator Erin Storis into this show. And so I worked with actually a marbling print that comes from the University College Library archives. They actually don't have so many books. That's not really what they specialize in. They don't have so many books with marbling prints from that era. So this is one of the few that they did have. And the work is made of gelatin. It was exhibited in this space that's kind of semi-outside. So it withstood a month of pretty intense springtime rain, really kind of amazing fluctuations in temperature. And the work itself kind of holds this memory in its form of the exhibition as the material has kind of shifted in response to those changes in the weather and in the climate. So on the left is one of the works when it was first installed, and on the right is an image of the work a couple of weeks into the exhibition. And just a close-up of the work where, again, I've used this kind of practice of gathering materials, and I've embedded these pieces of jewelry that I've gathered from people. And here is an installation image also with Nabil's work. So I know I'm over time. I'm going to stop sharing and we'll go from there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shannon. Um, we'll go into the conversation bit of today's talk, actually. Um, One of the things that actually stood out to me, and this was a part of the point that Shannon has brought up, the connection of blurriness between your work and Nabil's work. The internet, being intentional with the using of, the blurry effect, whether it is unmaking of the work or making the work. I suppose my question to you both, what was like the inspiration? Was it something that you thought of while you were creating the work, or was it something that an idea that you were playing with? Like, if you could walk us through that I can't even talk anymore. The coffee's just like, whoa. The intentionality of using the blurriness in the work that either you're unmaking by having people walk through it or making.
You want me to start?
That would be great.
I'm already unmuted. Well, I feel like, yeah, again, I'm so happy to be in this space. It's interesting, thinking about Avalon's connection to photography and Nabil's connection to photography, which I knew a bit about before. But I think I have this kind of like latent, I do work a lot with print or with images, and so these connections to photography and the history of photography do come up, and they seem to be really bubbling up again for me in a real way. And I'm gonna go about this in the way that I do, which will be a bit meandering, but I'll get there. I'll get there, I promise. Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking actually about my work with gelatin, and there's kind of so much there around, I started working with it knowing it's this, I work with gelatin that's actually sort of used for in food consumption. And so there are these kinds of, for me, these like parallel histories to this material where I was initially thinking about it in terms of its connection to being a food, to being something consumed. I'm thinking about the ways that it's kind of unstable. That's actually why I started working with it, but it really surprised me in the way that it could have these aspects of instability, but there are also ways of working with it where it could become actually quite kind of stable and firm and archival in a way, which is really obvious probably to a photographer, because there's also this history of gelatin as a really kind of key material in the history of photography, specifically, silver gelatin prints. And it's this material that's able, in terms of photography, um, it's able to hold and suspend image so that image can actually be fixed. And so it's not that the gelatin itself is the thing that's fixed, but it's allowing something to be fixed. So this kind of ability to hold is super interesting. And I've been reading and thinking about some really kind of great work by an academic, Siobhan Angus, who wrote a book, Camera Geologica, where she rethinks photography from the mine, actually. So thinking about the kind of mineral extractions that are really embedded in the kind of history of the camera and how image making comes to be at play. So I've been thinking about this more so with this work of mine with gelatin, where there is this kind of connection also to working with image. There's very much a connection, as I've tried to outline with where I'm working with these marbling prints, where I'm really thinking about these kind of qualities of either openness or a kind of fixity. I think there's really something around a kind of colonial imaginary that we continue to exist within that fixes things, that has such a desire to fix things, and whether that's fixing land and property to make it something that you can extract wealth from, but also, how the photograph plays into this. Of course, there's this kind of history of fixing the image or moving towards a kind of technical image, an image that is, supposedly representing the reality that's in front of us. So there's this kind of, move across time to do this that has been really violent. The kind of core of that is actually, really actually about accumulation for a few people that rests on a lot of expropriation and a lot of violence. So I'm thinking about all these things, and for me, in a way, fixity is really related to that. And so I think the blur in my work, I didn't enter into the work thinking about blur specifically, especially with the sand installations, but I really thought about this idea of unfixing. And it's something that comes up again, I think, across all of my work, where I'm kind of interested in these moments of unfixing. The gelatin as well. It begins in one form and then it changes over time in response to something that I can't completely control. So the blur for me is this way of actually enlivening a relationship to land, to stone, to sand. And for me, it's kind of about creating another pattern, a pattern that I can't predict. But I'm maybe on the precipice of thinking more about the blur, and excited to know more about how Nabil thinks about it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, it's interesting to think about all these sort of relations between our work and on a conceptual level, but I think blur is like, I don't know, for me, it always really felt like this really generative space that really pushed up against the sort of representational nature of photography in some ways. And I think that there's really this sort of and that representational sort of, for better or for worse, and sometimes very much for worse, this sort of categorization of it. And it's interesting, I can't tell you how many people have looked at my work and feel like frustrated by it, perhaps, or sort of like, what I think we want images to tell us what's happening. We want them to be this sort of bearer of information in some way. And I think that has to do with our sort of, as Shannon is saying, this sort of this sort of like death drive of information, of wanting things to be fixed, of wanting to know what's happening. And I think we have this same relationship to history in some ways. And for me, history and personal history was always much more, for lack of better words, blurry. I learned it through family. I learned it through oral histories, written histories. And I think in some ways also blur presents this really interesting sort of juxtaposition between accident and intention. I think that sort of blur, at least from a photographic apparatus or something, is often an accident in some ways, and so it's interesting to take this sort of element of chance or this element of accident and apply some sort of structure to it, so you're actually using it productively in some way. I was always super drawn to sort of pictures of like, when your thumb is on the lens, or there's like all these blurry images that you end up throwing out. Like those were the ones I was always most sort of like attracted to in some ways, because I felt like it was like the camera talking to me in some sort of way, that it had some sort of agency over itself and it was doing something. And so I don't know, that's kind of how I'm thinking about blur in some ways in regards to the sort of photographic project. And it has this really interesting relationship to ambiguity in some ways. And and it's totally this sort of action that, behind it is holding so much information, and it has to do with this sort of accessibility of information, and which is a huge conversation in some ways. And I think, even the sort of inviting people to walk on sand in some sort of way, and these sort of materials of life that are all around us, and sort of and that relationship to it is really interesting, Shannon, because you're sort of inviting viewers to activate that sense for themselves, instead of it being at the artist's hand in some way, which is feels like two really different approaches, but is also has a lot of similarities as well.
Yeah, Nabil, you just touched on something that I was thinking about in this realm of blur. And for me, like just to preface when I'm using this word accessibility in terms of like the context of this conversation, I'm using it very holistically. And it's something that I definitely think about in relationship to exhibitionary affect as an accessibility tool, right? We're deprioritizing language, we're deprioritizing one way of knowing, and we're offering that agency back to the viewer to make sense of what is in the room with them in constructs that they have and how they come to the exhibition. And so for me, Blur is an accessibility tool. Like I think that it refuses perfection. And so within that, it opens up for different contexts and ways of understanding and an invitation to be read and kind of bringing forward, these new histories onto the image or the thing that the viewer is interacting with. And I think that within that, it's like this incredibly powerful thing that we can use in terms of like just inviting openness. And I see that in both of your works.
I love thinking about that as a way of exhibition making. I think that's like, I don't know, for me at least anyway, that's something that probably really drives working in art at all, right? I think that there's actually kind of so much, radical potential for remaking ways of knowing and decentering a knowing that comes from, a very long history that's not, that's not unwrapped up in this kind of history I've shared in terms of the book, in terms of kind of trying to naturalize certain colonial logics. I just have been reading Sylvia Wynter today, so that's where my head is at, and she's so amazing. But yeah, just kind of thinking about this kind of centrality of a certain vision of who is a human and who gets to know and what is knowing, and what does knowledge look like. So I think, to kind of decenter that is super important. And I think the Blur then, it's like, well, Nabil, you talked about this idea of accident versus intention. I think I'm always so interested in accident. I think I'm not interested in the image that I would make. Some artists are really incredible in authoring images, and I love that also. I'm not that kind of artist. I'm like a person who's really interested in looking at what's already there, and sensitizing us to it in some kind of way. So I feel like this is a way, the Blur almost becomes a way of like getting out of a realm that's connected to like cognition, the desire for a certain kind of representation, a certain kind of stability. It's moving us into the kind of a different way of attuning or a different way of making.
Yeah, I think that's important what you're saying. And also this sort of idea of like accidents, it also opens up this for the work to be materially involved, because you're creating accidents within materials in a lot of ways, and you're giving them sort of priority. And I see that happening in your work a lot as well.
And within that, the refusal of immediacy. And I think that this is a really important one. And when we're thinking about discomfort, right? And that discomfort of walking or that discomfort of looking, I'm pointing to both of you where you are on my screen, which I realize might not be the same for everyone. But that's, I think, where this discomfort comes in, right? Because there is, again, so much that we are given at rapid succession. And it's just readily available to us in any corner of the internet, right? And so to not have that, and to sit with having to make sense of something, understand how something feels, I think like that's where that discomfort sits.
And it's always interesting to see the visitors who do come to the gallery to see, the exhibitions. They take time taking a look at both of your works. They take a closer look at Shannon's, they take a closer look at Nabil's. And what's interesting with where Nabil's work is situated, there's another artist in the main gallery space, Coco Guzman's. There's like a bit of a correspondence between the color scheme of Nabil's work, the Untitled series, and then Coco's work that's plastered on the wall. It's also gray with lines there that's being present. So it's an interesting introduction to one exhibition or an exit of another exhibition. So it's interesting to see like the transition from the special projects gallery where we have the presence in the past or undetermined future into the main gallery space where we are exhibiting fortitude and fragile. So it's an interesting conversation that's happening in the gallery space. Um, I guess my question would be to Nabil specifically. So, Nabil, your work, it highlights the physicality of the photographs. There's traces of time and damage and marks. How do you see these elements as part of the part of the image's history, so to speak? Kind of like what you were speaking about, finding an image by accident, and then working with it, and then having it showcased here.
Mm. I think, you know, I think it's really about thinking about the surface of a photograph and the material of a photograph and this sort of the physicality of it makes it so much more real in some ways. And I'm just, as we said, in this sort of accidental nature, I'm interested in how images can be, stored and manipulated by accident in some ways, or thrown and in the street, and sort of there's these marks of dust on them. And I think those are, when you print an image, it becomes a whole new history to that image. You're not looking at what happened, you're looking at the surface of an object, which is signifying that. And that's so interesting because that object itself also has a life to itself, and to bring Shannon into it as well, I think it's really fascinating, this sort of um how we're both playing with that in some ways. Your blinds are like emulate film in some sort of way, but don't have a very different archival source, whereas my work is sort of abstracting this archival found nature. I don't know, it's just interesting to think of that sort of, I don't know, the relationship is very interesting to me.
Mhm. And then to you, Shannon, the works of the blinds too. Like it looks like it's very, well, not looks like, I'm pretty sure it is labor intensive. And then there is what it looks like the notion of labor. It is central to your work, both in terms of the invisible labor that's embedded in everyday structures and your own process making. Could you walk us through the process of when you were creating the blinds too? I feel like that would be very interesting to listen to as well.
Yeah, I thought I would have had more. I always do this where I talk too much at the beginning. So I was going to talk more about it, but this is great. I sort of want to pick up on some of these really rich thoughts that Nabil was speaking about. And yeah, thinking about this relationship also for both of us across surface. Like I spend so much time working with surface. I'm so interested in surface. I mean, it's so surface is so derided. I'm often really working also with like ornament and pattern. There's this whole kind of history of uh, aligning these things, of aligning surface and aligning pattern and ornament in a way with certain gendered bodies or certain racialized bodies. There's kind of a long history in the Western canon around that. So I'm really interested in working with surface for some of those reasons, maybe. And it's also fun. You can't deny it. It's also fun. But it's also this thing again where it's right there. There is an immediacy to surface. And yet I think about across both of our practices, there's all of this withholding, though, around immediacy. As Avalon has talked about this kind of refusal of immediacy, and maybe to kind of jump back even to that idea of the blur that I think is being used in such interesting ways in Nabil's practice, for example, and the way that it's maybe coming out in mine too, is this refusal of immediacy, but it's also like a refusal of it's a refusal of consumption, right? That, we very much live in a world where images are meant to be consumed, and they're meant to be kind of consumed immediately. So I'm thinking about all of these things and thinking about this refusal. I've kind of talked to you just about the idea even of the blinds, the way in which there's a kind of withholding. But it's a withholding that actually asks you to look at something, whether it's, in the case of a blind, I'm maybe asking you to think about built spaces or domestic space, or I showed you this work by Heidi Bucher, for example, where her practice was very much invested in, working in the kind of latter half of the 20th century, where she's asking us to again kind of look at things that are maybe not, they're sort of thought of as blank. I feel like there's this relationship also between the blur and a kind of withholding, and maybe a strategy of blankness, or processes of invisibility. So I am getting to your question, Susan. So I'm trying to kind of lead us through some of these ideas to this idea of invisibility, which is something I work a lot with in my practice, and that I've really learned from other people, other artists, but also other scholars. I think a lot about the kind of work of, whether it's feminist theory, or it's queer theory, or it's post-colonial theory, or it's Black studies or Indigenous studies, where I often think that partially the work of, maybe specifically the artists I'm showing you are a kind of feminist practice, is really invested in looking at what has been naturalized and what has that process of naturalization actually made invisible. And so I think about feminist practices that are really kind of drawing attention back to the ways that certain kinds of people or certain kinds of bodies are performing certain kinds of labor. So whether that's kind of domestic labor or reproductive labor, and the ways in which those kind of relationships get totally normalized, so that you think that it's normal that a certain kind of person, or a certain kind of gender, a certain kind of racialized person is doing certain kinds of work. And usually that's the work that is unseen. Usually it's the work that is not valuable. It's not the work of the kind of hero in the story, right? But it's the work that is the actual foundation for all of that other so-called productive work, or for the hero's journey to kind of take place upon that foundation that's been laid bare. So I think a lot about labor in that kind of politicized way, or with a kind of relationship to gender or race. But I mean, it's true that also my work is really laborious, and like in its making, just in a basic sense. I think because I really, it's like, it's a little bit what Avalon is talking about in terms of a kind of practice of, maybe working with material or affect, where it's a different way, it's a whole kind of different system of knowing the world. I really love contending with material, and I really love that difficult, strenuous work. So I'm kind of thinking about all of these things. I'm thinking about this kind of relationship to labor. I'm thinking about invisibility. I mean, I didn't really get to talk about it so much, but I've mentioned the way in which I'm thinking about, also the material of sand. So certainly it's about, certain kind of labor of certain bodies that's been invisibilized or naturalized. And there is a kind of parallel process that happens also with extracting materials, so that certain materials kind of form the basis upon which we can do any of this stuff. And it's the same kind of thing. And those processes have been made invisible or made to seem completely kind of normal or something. It's the reality. We shouldn't kind of that's the reality that we contend with. So I'm quite interested in this way, in just also the pleasure of working with material, but also kind of bringing back my labor into the work. And then I think there's something about, maybe especially in the case of sand installations, where somehow that labor is visible and it makes the work powerful. So specifically, you've asked me specifically about the work at onsite. And so really, and maybe we'll just share a little bit about, it's a laborious process where I pour out gelatin into sheets, essentially. I've worked with gathering these pieces of jewelry from many people who want to contribute something to the work. And again, there's this kind of relationship to their body there. Jewelry is something you wear on your body, so it's kind of embedding those histories into the work. And I pour out these sheets of gelatin, and I actually work in a way where I'm kind of making, again, almost a contact print. So I work with the marbling prints, and I print them out onto a kind of transparency that can be transferred and picked up by the gelatin. So then the image is sort of in the skin of the gelatin itself. So it's transferred over. And then it's, the scale of them, I think you can see when you're in the exhibition space, is very large. Just when you're working at that scale with something material, it's laborious. And I actually then kind of cut the work into these slats to create the kind of blind form. So that's how those are made. And that's a little bit about how I'm thinking about labor, and trying to kind of thread this through some of our conversation here.
Thank you. I guess my next question, it would be to Avalon. Just going back in time, Avalon, I suppose when the call of submission went out, how, how did you select Shannon and Nabil for the exhibition? And how did their practices engage with the time, memory, and, futurality when you were putting the exhibition proposal together, I suppose?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so it's a year ago.
Yeah.
It's 2024. The buds are coming through the ground. I think I was aware of Shannon and Nabil's practice prior to the exhibition, and had been following them both for a while. Nabil through Franz Kaka, and also seeing Capture, the photography billboard. That was the first time that I had seen Nabil's work large scale. And I remember just sitting with it and being like, this is gonna, like, I want to work with this. It was really exciting to me. And Shannon's work I had seen and actually interacted with at Patel Brown. And again, kind of, identifying artists that are working around these ideas of affect for me as a curator is really important, because then I feel like there's just a synergy within the curatorial process, which is really lovely. And it is, kind of a process of matchmaking in a sense, because I think that especially with two-person exhibitions, as both Shannon and Nabil have kind of identified, is it's a very intimate space. And so it doesn't serve the exhibition or the artists exhibiting to kind of comprise something that doesn't necessarily have through lines or have conversation between. And it was also very important for me in this exhibition space to ensure that the sightlines that were created would always have works in conversation with one another. And so again, making sure that there are kind of like these through themes and synergies between Shannon's work and Nabil's work. And I think that, we've kind of talked about some of those through lines here today. And so it was just really, reaching out and saying, hey, and engaging in a studio visit and hearing what they were both working on and what they were both excited to potentially present, and seeing how those projects could kind of come together, and it did in a really beautiful way.
Awesome. And I guess you've spoken quite a lot about exhibitionary affect, Avalon, and it seems like it is a core of your curatorial practice. And there is element of the affect being present in Shannon's work and in Nabil's work, especially when, like visitors are taking a closer look and spending more time in looking at their works. So I'm just wondering if we can talk a little bit about the affect component that's present in both the works, part of your curatorial practice, as well as, both of your artistic practices as well. If that is intentional to the work that you create, or if it's something that just came along and you're like, ooh, this is great to work with conceptually and otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about it a little bit in the curatorial essay, and I think within both of their works, and scale is part of this and process is part of this, but there's this idea of a life force that both of their works specifically that are being exhibited, but I think practice as a whole really embody for me. And so when I'm thinking about affect in their works, it's like kind of keyed into this idea of these life forces. And so Shannon's, we have obviously the scale of it, and we have the very immediate process that we're met with, but then there's also these like unfurling objects within them. And as Shannon spoke, jewelry specifically, so how close that is to a body and how that carries a history. And so there's just all of these entry points that relate to, a force or a history that is a continuing. It's not stagnant, it's not finished, but it moves forward. And then with Nabil's work, specifically working with archival imagery, and so that having a historical context, but then bringing it forward for artistic intervention or manipulation within himself as a present artist, like that for me kind of has that same quality where we're oscillating, and it's not like a static finished thing, but it continues to evolve.
Awesome. I guess maybe now would be a good time to turn the floor to our online audience if they have any questions, to drop it in the chat. But in the meantime, while we are waiting for the questions to pop up in the chat room on our YouTube channel, maybe if you can all speak to kind of like what's coming up next in terms of like next project, next exhibitions, current works that you're currently working on, that would be fantastic.
Who wants to go first? Okay, I'm already talking. I actually just opened an exhibition this past Thursday at the Plum. It's called This Is a Place, and it is also with Contact Photography Festival. It's showcasing 5 photographers, and it will be up until May 17th at the Plum.
Awesome.
I'm working or just finished an exhibition that's opening this coming Friday at Franz Kaka. It's my second solo exhibition there. That's opening Friday evening. So I've been working on that pretty diligently. And then I have an exciting opportunity coming up maybe in September. I'm going to be working with Danica Pintrick, who Shannon has worked with as well, in a really exciting space. So those are a few things to look out for.
Thank you.
I was thinking about this question earlier today, and it's always such a funny question to deal with because you're like, what? Am I allowed to say I'm doing what is actually happening? And now we'll have this document. So if some of these things don't come to pass, well, it's nice to mark it in time. Yeah, and working towards a number of things, not sure yet if I'm able to share all of them, but yeah, stay tuned. Some interesting also pairings with other artists who I really admire. So I think hopefully continuing that relationship. I am working towards an exhibition for I think late July with Patel Brown in Montreal. So yeah, more details TBA on that. And yeah, a couple other things in the works. And then, I, as a doctoral student, should be presenting a comprehensive exhibition as part of my comprehensive exams, perhaps in the fall, but we shall see. So I'm on the cusp of a number of things. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. So we do have a bit of activity in the chat room. The first one, it's more of a comment, so I hope I make, do justice with the statement. They say yes or yas. Yas. So thank you so much, Philip. Next, now we do have two questions for real. So one question is from Lisa Deanne Smith, our senior curator at Onsite Gallery. She said, a great exhibition. Thank you. Your practices are inspiring. I appreciate that none of you are categorizing this work as abstract art. I'm curious about the cues that help the audience be in the blur. So helping the audience, giving them, cues about, being in the blur, kind of like what we talked about a bit.
I could maybe talk about how like I saw this within both of their works. I think going back to photography and kind of like the elements, the elemental core principles of like comprising of photographs, something that we learn about is leading lines. And so it's like how we direct an eye through a space or through a frame. And for me, within Nabil's work, there were a lot of those moments. And so just as like an eye traveling through a space, having these kind of leading lines within the work really allowed me to kind of like sink into them further, like being beheld in that blur. And then within Shannon's work, it is, as I spoke to, kind of the revealing. The closer you look, you start to see these objects. And so they are able to kind of give you these entry points or hold you in space within the blur. So that's how I kind of saw that happening.
Thank you. Awesome.
Yeah.
Go for it, Shannon.
To Nabil. Yeah, feel free to jump in. I think that's a lovely question. How did Lisa put it? How do we?
So she's curious about the cues that help the audience be in the blur.
Yeah, cues to help be in the blur. Well, there's so many that, I think as we're hopefully talking about here, there's no one way to read this work. There's no way to read the work. As Avalon's kind of talked about this curatorial approach, it's really in many ways a kind of embodied experience. So there's no wrong way. So there are many cues, but something that was brought up earlier in the conversation is a relationship to light, which is, of course, so key in photography. And complicated. I think, again, like I told you, in terms of my relationship to working with the marbling prints, where I started doing this out of a kind of almost intuition that there was something about the way that these things are made. There's something about the quality of image, these kind of formal properties that really connects to other questions or processes that I'm interested in my own practice. I feel that way also about the use of light in my work. I flashed up an image of a show where I basically created lampshades, these really strange lampshades made out of gelatin, stained with these colors and embedded again with these plant clippings. And in part, my use of light in that instance, I mean, first of all, when you walk into the space, it's a very different kind of exhibition space to walk into. It's soft. I think some of these cues right away maybe talk about a different kind of looking, or like not even a looking, right? It's a feeling, it's affect. And there's also something about the use of light where I find that the work is able to kind of elude capture, where it's like you can't really ever have it, because this kind of glow is a thing that you can't make firm or static. And I think about, I think a lot about the kind of relationship to light that blinds have, and really kind of signaling something around cycles of time. I mean, we open the blinds in the morning, we close them at night, perhaps. So there's this kind of relationship to light. Maybe they're trying to keep light out. I mean, here I'm making this work that it's not a very effective blind, because you can't do that with a kind of regularity. It's actually allowing light to filter through. So there's this kind of diffuseness, this softness to it. And it's fluctuating. As Avalon talked about, this show itself has spanned, really 2 seasons or many more, given that we're kind of living in such an erratic climate time. And so there's a change in light. And there's a way in which, maybe the exhibition is inviting a kind of repeated engagement with it, where it can't really be had all at once, because that light is kind of ever shifting. So I think that might be one of the cues that is like happening just at the level of something you might just sense in your body. Yeah.
I think there's also this sense of prolonged looking that was spoken about, and sort of yeah, in detailing kind of the interactions of viewers. I think it leaves this sort of transparency for the viewer in some sort of way, where they don't where they question the work either materially or conceptually, or understanding its sort of historical background in some way. And I think it very much just kind of yeah, positions the viewer in a place where there's this sort of curiosity, or this, as we said, sort of not knowing, and that kind of circling is to me a really generative space for a viewer in some sort of way. It's not, it's a sentence that keeps on going, I guess. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you all. So last question. This is from Cara Hamilton. They ask, curious how the work changes for Shannon in the new space.
Hi, Kara. Kara is an amazing, incredible artist and lovely friend, and also a fellow studio mate. So I feel like Kara has really gotten maybe an opportunity to have that kind of repeated encounter with the work in lots of different forms over time. I mean, it's so different in this space, but it's really I really love this opportunity to show the work again, because it was really, created the dimensions, the scale, the pattern I'm working with all came out of that initial site specific, iteration. And I love that the work carries that history of that exhibition into the space at Onsite, into this exhibition with Nabil, where there's kind of so much about, thinking about histories, thinking about connections to futurities. How does it change in the space? I mean, in so many different ways. I think it's also a bit terrifying to make work in a way that is so responsive to light, because you never quite know until you get the work into the site what its relationship to light is going to be. And I find that these blinds have really had this kind of, again, shifty relationship to how image is working, how transparency is working. And so initially, when they were installed at University of Toronto, light was kind of hitting at certain times of the day from one direction. And so there's actually like a side of the blinds that was really quite dark, like almost opaque, this kind of amazing, like almost like black glass. And then the other side, when the light was hitting, would be, really activated with light. And I think in Onsite, it's a bit different because there is a bit of, there are lights in the gallery in addition to that really amazing ground level, huge window. So I think just there's something that changes so much about how the work functions based on how light is moving through it. I don't know exactly how to qualify it. I feel like I'm a very slow thinker, and it'll probably take me another 6 months after the exhibition to understand how exactly it's different. But yeah, it's different in that way. I also would say that having moved it from, being outside in that initial instance to being inside, I think there's maybe more of an understanding of its scale than you might have had in the first iteration. So I really appreciate that. And, there's something kind of monstrous about the work, like for me, in a good way. And so I think they're very imposing in the space. When you're there in person, these things are kind of dropped down basically from the ceiling and very kind of imposing. So I think, but at the same time as they're monstrous, I think their monstrosity is also this kind of softness, and also this kind of like, allowing light to kind of move through and be soft. So I think those are maybe some of the changes. And of course, then it's like being in conversation with Nabil's work, just on the level of kind of formally what's happening with the wall vinyl. It's presenting this like beautiful, there's such a warmth in the space just with the kind of color palette of what's coming out with that work. And so I feel like there's this kind of flickering happening. It almost feels like there's like a fire in there, like in a, like it's a fire that's like warming this exhibition. So I think there's something about light, there's something about being in conversation with Nabil's work where the work is so different. But it's very changeable work. I never quite know what it's going to be. And the last thing I'll say about that is that also it's really difficult to reinstall this work. Like incredibly hard and terrifying. And thank you, on-site team. The team is incredible, and so many people worked really hard to bring the work back to life. So I will say also, just in rehanging it, I kind of had one opportunity to get it in place. And so there's even just something about formally the way that the slats are falling is different than it was the first time. So I'd say in this case, there's a lot more porosity actually in the work.
Awesome. Thank you, Shannon. So before I go into our upcoming program, any last comments, insights that you all would like to share?
I just want to thank y'all for taking the space.
Yeah.
That was really lovely and super nice. And yeah, it's always so nice to chat through the work, and it's always very inspiring to to see these sort of connections between artists. It's been great. And yeah, thank you so much to all of you and Avalon especially.
Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And to everyone who joined us today. That was fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you all. So before we call it a day, I would like to say that this event does wrap up our April programming. But for May, we have three exciting events lined up for anybody who would like to join us at the gallery. Our first event, it's going to be on Friday, May 9th from 5 to 7. And we are excited to collaborate with OCAD University's creative writing program. And it's part of GradX, where we are celebrating this year's graduating cohort of the creative writing program. So if y'all are free, pop by. On Friday, May 16, from 6 to 8, it is another rendition of Dyke Night at Onsite Gallery. And this is part of the upcoming back-to-back closing weekend of the exhibition events. So this year we are teaming up with Sweaty Betty, Another Bookstore, and Come As You Are to co-present Dyke Night. So expect a night of community celebration as well as joy while being in the gallery space. And our final May event features a special performative storytelling experience with the Fortitude and Fragile exhibiting artists Francisco Fernando Grandos and Vesna Purovic. And through their layered performance, they will explore themes of lived and diasporic experiences, vulnerability, and resilience. So that is the end of the upcoming May events. And for those of us who have joined us today, thank you so much. Thank you, Nabil. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Avalon, for coming into this virtual space, speaking about the current exhibition, Presence in a Past or Undetermined Future, that is exhibited here at Onsite Gallery, located on 199 Richmond Street. Have a great weekend. Well, not weekend, not yet, but have a great evening wherever y'all are at, and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.
Not a
Thanks, Susan.
problem. Bye, everyone.